11.2 Steps of a Conclusion. In section 11.1, Why Conclusions Matter, we discussed the importance a conclusion has on a speech. In this section, we're going to examine the 3 steps in building an effective conclusion. Restatement of the thesis. Restating a thesis statement is the first step in a powerful conclusion. As we explained in Chapter 9, Introductions Matter, How to Begin a Speech Effectively, a thesis statement is a short, declarative sentence that states the purpose, intent, or main idea of a speech. When we restate the thesis statement at the conclusion of our speech, we are attempting to re-emphasize what the overarching main idea of your speech has been. Suppose your thesis statement was, I will analyze Barack Obama's use of lyricism in his July 2008 speech, A World That Stands as One. You could restate the thesis in this fashion at the conclusion of your speech. In the past few minutes, I've analyzed Barack Obama's use of lyricism in his July 2008 speech, A World That Stands as One. Notice the shift in tense. The statement has gone from future tense, this is what I will speak about, to past tense, this is what I have spoken about. Restating the thesis in your conclusion reminds the audience of the major purpose or goal of your speech, helping them to remember it better. Review of main points. After restating the speech's thesis, a second step in a powerful conclusion is to review the main points of your speech. One of the biggest differences between written and oral communication is the necessity of repetition in oral communication. When we preview our main points in the introduction, effectively discuss and make transitions to our main points during the body of the speech, and finally review the main points in the conclusion, we increase the likelihood that the audience will retain our main points after the speech is over. In the introduction of a speech, we deliver a preview of our main body points, and in the conclusion, we deliver a review. Let's look at a sample preview. In order to understand the field of gender and communication, I will first differentiate between the terms biological sex and gender. I will then explain the history of gender research in communication. Lastly, I will examine a series of important findings related to gender and communication. In this preview, we have 3 clear main points. Let's see how we can review them at the conclusion of our speech. Today, we have differentiated between the terms biological sex and gender, examined the history of gender research in communication, and analyzed a series of research findings on the topic. Or, in the past few minutes, I have explained the difference between the terms biological sex and gender, discussed the rise of gender research in the field of communication, and examined a series of groundbreaking studies in the field. Notice that both of these conclusions review the main points originally set forth. Both variations are equally effective reviews of the main points, but you may like the linguistic turn of one over the other. Remember, while there's a lot of science to help us understand public speaking, there is also a lot of art as well. So, you are always encouraged to choose the wording that you think will be most effective for your audience. Concluding device. The final part of a powerful conclusion is the concluding device. A concluding device is essentially the final thought you want your audience members to have when you stop speaking. It also provides a definitive sense of closure to your speech. One of the authors of this text often makes an analogy between a gymnastics dismount and the concluding device in a speech. Just as a gymnast dismounting the parallel bars or balance beam wants to stick the landing and avoid taking 2 or 3 steps, a speaker wants to stick the ending of the presentation by ending with a concluding device instead of, yeah, I guess I'm done. Miller observed that speakers tend to use 1 of 10 concluding devices when ending a speech. The rest of this section is going to examine these 10 concluding devices. Conclude with a challenge. The first way that Miller found that some speakers end their speeches is with a challenge. A challenge is a call to engage in some kind of activity that requires a contest or special effort. In a speech on the necessity of fundraising, a speaker could conclude by challenging the audience to raise 10% more than their original projections. In a speech on eating more vegetables, you could challenge your audience to increase their current intake of vegetables by 2 portions daily. In both of these challenges, audience members are being asked to go out of their way to do something different that involves effort on their part. Conclude with a quotation. A second way you can conclude a speech is by reciting a quotation relevant to the speech topic. When using a quotation, you need to think about whether your goal is to end on a persuasive note or an informative one. Some quotations will have a clear call to action, while other quotations summarize or provide thought. For example, let's say you're delivering an informative speech about dissident writers in the former Soviet Union. You could end by citing this quotation from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. A great writer is, so to speak, a second government in his country, and for that reason no regime has ever loved great writers. Notice that this quotation underscores the idea of writers as dissidents, but it doesn't ask listeners to put forth effort to engage in any specific thought process or behavior. If, on the other hand, you are delivering a persuasive speech, urging your audience to participate in a very risky political demonstration, you might use this quotation from Martin Luther King Jr. If a man hasn't discovered something he will die for, he isn't fit to live. In this case, the quotation leaves the audience with the message that great risks are worth taking, and that they make our lives worthwhile, and that the right thing to do is to go ahead and take that risk. Conclude with a summary. When a speaker ends with a summary, he or she is simply elongating the review of the main points. While this may not be the most exciting concluding device, it can be useful for information that was highly technical or complex, or for speeches lasting longer than 30 minutes. Typically, for short speeches like those in your class, this summary device should be avoided. Conclude by visualizing the future. The purpose of a conclusion that refers to the future is to help your audience imagine a future you can believe. The purpose of a conclusion that refers to the future is to help your audience imagine the future you believe can occur. If you are giving a speech on the development of video games for learning, you could conclude by depicting the classroom of the future, where video games are perceived as learning tools and how these tools could be utilized. More often, speakers use visualization of the future to depict how society would be, or how individual listeners' lives would be different. If the speaker's persuasive attempt worked, for example, if a speaker proposes that a solution to illiteracy is hiring more reading specialists in public schools, the speaker could ask his or her audience to imagine a world without illiteracy. In this use of visualization, the goal is to persuade people to adopt the speaker's point of view. By showing that the speaker's vision of the future is a positive one, the conclusion should help to persuade the audience to help create this future. Conclude with an appeal for action. Probably the most common persuasive concluding device is the appeal for action, or the call to action. In essence, the appeal for action occurs when a speaker asks his or her audience to engage in a specific behavior or change in thinking. When a speaker concludes by asking the audience to do or to think in a specific manner, the speaker wants to see an actual change. Whether the speaker appeals for people to eat more fruit, buy a car, vote for a candidate, oppose the death penalty, or sing more in the shower, the speaker is asking the audience to engage in action. One specific type of appeal for action is the immediate call to action. Whereas some appeals ask for people to engage in behavior in the future, the immediate call to action asks people to engage in behavior right now. If a speaker wants to see new traffic lights placed at dangerous intersections, he or she may conclude by asking all the audience members to sign a digital petition right then and there, using a computer the speaker has made available. Here are some more examples of immediate calls to action. In a speech on eating more vegetables, pass out raw veggies and dip at the conclusion of the speech. In a speech on petitioning a lawmaker for a new law, provide audience members with a pre-written email that they can send to the lawmaker. In a speech on the importance of using hand sanitizer, hand out little bottles of hand sanitizer and show the audience members how to correctly apply the hand sanitizer. In a speech about asking for donations for a charity, send a box around the room asking for donations. These are just a handful of different examples we have actually seen students use in our classroom to elicit immediate change in behavior. These immediate calls to action may not lead to long-term change, but they can be very effective at increasing the likelihood that an audience will change their behavior in the short term. Conclude by inspiration. By definition, the word inspire means to affect or arouse someone. Both affect and arouse have strong emotional connections. The ultimate goal of an inspiration concluding device is similar to an appeal for action, but the ultimate goal is more lofty or ambiguous. The goal is to stir someone's emotions in a specific manner. Maybe a speaker is giving an informative speech on the prevalence of domestic violence in society today. That speaker could end the speech by reading Paulette Kelly's powerful poem, I Got Flowers Today. It's a poem that evokes strong emotions because it is about an abuse victim who received flowers from her abuser every time she was victimized. The poem ends by saying, I got flowers today. Today was a special day. It was the day of my funeral. Last night, he killed me. Conclude with advice. The next concluding device is one that should be used primarily by speakers who are recognized as expert authorities on a given subject. Advice is essentially a speaker's opinion about what should or should not be done. The problem with opinions is that everybody has one, and one person's opinion is not necessarily any more correct than another's. There needs to be a really good reason for your opinion, and therefore your advice should matter to your audience. If, for example, you're an expert in nuclear physics, you might conclude a speech on energy by giving advice about the benefits of nuclear energy. Conclude by proposing a solution. Another way a speaker can conclude a speech powerfully is to offer a solution to the problem discussed within a speech. For example, perhaps a speaker has been discussing the problems associated with the disappearance of art education in the United States. The speaker could then propose a solution of creating more community-based art experiences for children as a way to fill this gap. Although this can be an effective conclusion, a speaker must ask herself or himself whether the solution should be discussed in more depth as a standalone main point within the body of the speech, so that the audience concerns about the proposed solution may be addressed. Conclude with a question. Another way you can end your speech is to ask a rhetorical question that forces the audience to ponder an idea. Maybe you're giving a speech on the importance of the environment, so you end the speech by saying, think about your children's future. What kind of world do you want them raised in? A world that is clean, vibrant, and beautiful? Or one that is filled with smog, pollution, filth, and disease? Notice, you aren't actually asking the audience to verbally or non-verbally answer this question. The goal of the question is to force the audience into thinking about what kind of world they want for their children. Conclude with a reference to audience. The last concluding device discussed by Miller was a reference to one's audience. This concluding device is when a speaker attempts to answer the basic audience question, what's in it for me? The goal of this concluding device is to spell out the direct benefits a behavior or thought change has for the audience members. For example, a speaker talking about stress reduction techniques could conclude by clearly listing all the physical health benefits stress reduction offers. Improved reflexes, improved immune system, improved hearing, reduction in blood pressure. In this case, the speaker is clearly spelling out why audience members should care. What's in it for them? Informative versus persuasive conclusions. As you read through the 10 possible ways to conclude a speech, hopefully you noticed that some of the methods are more appropriate for persuasive speeches and others are more appropriate for informative speeches. To help you choose appropriate conclusions for informative, persuasive, or entertaining speeches, there's a table in your book. It is Table 11.1, Your Speech Purpose and Concluding Devices. Key takeaways. An effective conclusion contains 3 basic parts: a restatement of the speech's thesis, a review of the main points discussed within the speech, and a concluding device that helps create a lasting image in the audience's minds. Miller, in 1946, found that speakers tend to use one of 10 concluding devices. All of these devices are not appropriate for all speeches, so speakers need to determine which concluding device would have the strongest, most powerful effect for a given audience, purpose, and occasion.